White lead face paint. Ceruse, also called Venetian ceruse, was the defining cosmetic of European royal courts from roughly the 1500s through the 1700s, and it was made almost entirely of lead acetate. The logic behind it was simple and brutal. Pale skin meant you never worked outdoors. And in a world where your complexion announced your social rank before you opened your mouth, aristocratic women, and many men, applied this thick white paste to their faces, necks, and chests every single day. Queen Elizabeth I is the most famous documented user. Her portraits showing that iconic chalk-white face with the high forehead and ghostly throat, and she wore it for approximately 30 years until her death in 1603. What those portraits don't show is what the ceruse was doing underneath. Lead absorbs directly through skin with prolonged contact, accumulating in soft tissue and bone over years, and the symptoms of chronic lead poisoning read like a slow-motion catastrophe. Hair loss, blackening and pitting of the skin, abdominal cramps, cognitive decline, seizures, and eventual organ failure. The cruelest part of the ceruse cycle was its self-reinforcing logic. The lead damaged and discolored the skin it touched, so wearers applied more ceruse to cover the damage, which caused more damage, which required more ceruse. Women who wore it daily also inadvertently ingested it by licking or biting their lips, adding internal exposure to the external. The direct causal link between Elizabeth I's ceruse use and her death is debated by historians, but the chemistry is not debatable at all. 30 years of daily lead application to the face is not something a human body survives without serious consequences. Arsenic green dye. When Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele invented his brilliant emerald green pigment in 1775, he created what would become the most fashionable and most quietly lethal color in European history. Scheele's green, and its successor Paris green, formulated in 1814, achieved their vivid color through copper arsenite, a compound that released arsenic dust continuously, especially when the fabric was warmed by body heat or moistened by sweat. This was not an abstract danger. Aristocratic women wore ball gowns, gloves, headdresses, and decorative flowers made with this dye, spending entire evenings dancing in heated rooms while arsenic particles drifted off every fold of their skirts and settled on their skin and into their lungs. The color was so desirable at court, so strongly associated with wealth and fashion, that warnings published in The Lancet in the 1850s and 1860s were largely ignored by the same women who could afford to read them. Factory workers producing the fabric died in documented numbers, their cases creating the first public evidence that the green was lethal. Queen Victoria's court was reportedly saturated with the color before its dangers became impossible to deny. Napoleon Bonaparte adds another layer to this story. The green painted wallpaper at his residence on St. Helena is suspected by some researchers to have released arsenic vapor into his living quarters, a hypothesis supported by analysis of hair samples taken after his death, though not universally accepted by historians. The green that glittered under candlelight in every fashionable ballroom in Europe was, at the molecular level, shedding poison with every movement. Heavily boned corsets. The boned corset is probably the most famous dangerous fashion item in history, but the reality was considerably more systematic and more damaging than its reputation suggests. Whalebone and later steel-boned corsets compressed the torso to achieve the fashionable silhouette, and at the extreme end of tight lacing, adult women reduced their waists to 16 or 18 inches, measurements that required the internal organs to physically move to accommodate them. The liver, stomach, and intestines were pushed downward and sideways. The lower ribs were deformed inward. The lungs, unable to fully expand against the rigid boning, could not take a complete breath, which is why fainting was so normalized in aristocratic women of this era that dedicated fainting couches and fainting rooms were standard features of grand houses, treated as practical furniture rather than medical emergencies. Court presentation in some royal families required corsets from girlhood, meaning the skeletal deformation began before bones had finished developing, permanently reshaping the skeleton around the fashion rather than the other way around. Catherine de' Medici reportedly mandated a 13-inch waist at the French court, though historians debate whether this figure is accurate or has been exaggerated over centuries of retelling. What is well attested is that 19th-century medical journals published explicit articles attributing internal injuries, displacement of organs, and respiratory illness to corseting, and that the doctors writing those articles were largely ignored by the aristocratic patients they were treating. Breathing was not just uncomfortable in a tightly laced corset, it was mechanically restricted, and women who were simultaneously wearing heavy skirts weighing upward of 14 pounds were operating their bodies under conditions that would be Considered dangerous in any modern context. Powdered wigs. The powdered wig became mandatory at European courts after Louis XIV adopted one to disguise his premature baldness sometime around 1655. And for the next century, it was one of the most reliable markers of aristocratic status on the continent. The powder used to whiten them, a mixture of starch, chalk, and sometimes flour, was applied in dedicated powdering rooms where it was blown onto the wig in clouds, inevitably coating the scalp, face, and lungs of everyone present. Some suppliers added lead or arsenic compounds to their powder formulations depending on the era and region, meaning the inhalation risk went beyond simple starch. Servants who powdered wigs daily suffered the highest exposure, but aristocrats, who spent their mornings in powdering rooms, were breathing this mixture consistently for years. The lice and flea infestations that thrived in warm, complex wig structures created a parallel danger. Louse-borne typhus killed more people in this era than many battlefield engagements, and the aristocratic habit of wearing elaborate hairpieces over their own hair created ideal conditions for infestation. Women's wigs grew to documented extremes, with some court examples exceeding 3 feet in height, requiring their wearers to kneel inside carriages or ride with their heads out of windows to avoid crushing the structure. The fashion also created a documented strain on grain supplies, with enormous quantities of flour consumed by aristocratic hairstyles during periods of scarcity, a social tension that fed directly into the revolutionary sentiment building in France and Britain. The British powder tax of 1795 effectively ended the fashion by making it expensive, which means the thing that finally killed the powdered wig was economics, rather than any recognition of the health toll it had been taking for generations. Hoop skirts and crinolines. The steel cage crinoline, patented in 1856, democratized a fashion that had previously required layers of heavy petticoats and made it available to almost any woman who could afford fabric. But in doing so, it also distributed one of the most consistently lethal garments in fashion history across an enormous population. The skirts produced by cage crinolines could measure up to 18 feet in circumference, and the steel framework that held them out also held them away from the body and allowed air to circulate freely beneath the fabric. In an era of open fireplaces and candles, this was catastrophically dangerous. The combination of large surface area, freely circulating air, and proximity to open flame meant that crinoline fires spread faster than the wearer could react, and contemporary newspapers reported them with the resigned frequency of a recurring seasonal hazard. An estimated 3,000 women died from crinoline fires in England between 1850 and 1860, though historians note that the precision of this figure is uncertain and some dispute its accuracy, even while acknowledging that crinoline fire deaths were genuinely numerous and well documented. Empress Eugenie of France, one of the most prominent crinoline wearers of the era and a major trendsetter across European courts, helped cement the fashion at the highest social levels precisely when its dangers were becoming undeniable. Beyond fire, the sheer mechanical reality of wearing an 18-foot bell of fabric caused carriage accidents, staircase falls, entanglement in machinery, and the inability to pass safely through standard doorways. The previous generation of petticoat-only skirts, before the cage crinoline reduced the weight, had caused documented spinal problems simply through the sustained load of carrying up to 14 pounds of fabric attached to the waist. High platform shoes. Venetian chopines represent one of the most literal translations of status into physical danger in fashion history. These platform shoes, worn by aristocratic women in Venice and Spain from roughly the 1400s through the 1650s, grew in height as they grew in social significance until the tallest surviving examples in the Museo Correr in Venice stand between 47 and 54 centimeters, nearly 20 inches, off the ground. The original purpose was practical, lifting the wearer above the muddy, waist-covered streets of Venice. But status competition transformed them into something that made independent walking essentially impossible. At extreme heights, wearing chopines required 2 servants walking alongside to physically support the wearer upright, and the fashion effectively converted aristocratic women into objects to be transported rather than people who moved under their own power. Falls from chopines cause broken bones, and in pregnant wearers, miscarriages, and at least one death from a fall is cited in historical sources, though specific documentation is difficult to confirm. The shoes were typically constructed from wood or cork and covered in velvet, silk, or leather, sometimes decorated with gold and jewels, and worn with elaborate gowns that added considerable additional weight to an already unstable structure. The Venetian government periodically attempted to regulate chopine heights, apparently recognizing that the fashion had reached a point of genuine public safety concern, though enforcement seems to have been inconsistent. Shakespeare references them casually in Hamlet. Your ladyship is nearer to heaven than when I saw you last, by the altitude of a chopine, suggesting that by the Elizabethan era, the absurdity and the danger of the style were both common enough knowledge to work as a throwaway joke. Radium jewelry and cosmetics. When Marie Curie discovered radium in 1898, she inadvertently handed the luxury goods industry one of the most dangerous marketing opportunities in history. Radium glowed softly in the dark with a blue-green light. It was extraordinarily rare, and in the years before its effects were understood, it was marketed as a health-giving, vitalizing substance that could rejuvenate the body and clarify the skin. Aristocratic and wealthy women wore radium-infused jewelry against their skin, kept radium face creams on their dressing tables, and traveled to radium spa treatments, all while receiving continuous ionizing radiation that was quietly damaging their DNA and dramatically elevating their cancer risk. The French cosmetic brand Thoradia was active in the 1930s, openly incorporating radium and thorium into its product line and marketing them as scientifically advanced beauty treatments. Eben Byers, a prominent American socialite and golf champion, drank a radium-laced health tonic called Radithor until his bones began to disintegrate. His death in 1932 and the Wall Street Journal's headline, "The Radium Water Worked Fine," until his jaw fell off, effectively marked the end of radium's fashionable period, though some products persisted beyond it. The most chilling legacy of radium cosmetics is material. Vintage containers from this era, occasionally surfacing in antique collections, have been found to be measurably radioactive and are now handled as hazardous materials. The half-life of radium-226 is approximately 1,600 years, which means those elegant glass bottles on those dressing tables are still radiating today, and will be for a very long time after everyone who once wore them has been forgotten. Antimony-based rouge and kohl. Long before European courts discovered the cosmetic possibilities of lead and arsenic, ancient Egyptian royalty were applying heavy eye cosmetics containing lead sulfide and antimony sulfide to their faces as part of daily court ritual. Archaeological analysis of cosmetic pots from royal Egyptian contexts has confirmed the presence of both galena and stibnite, the mineral forms of these compounds, applied thickly around the eyes where the mucous membranes offer direct absorption into the bloodstream. Antimony causes nausea, vomiting, heart arrhythmia, and liver damage with sustained exposure, and applying it to the eyes daily from childhood, as royal Egyptian court protocol required, constituted a form of chronic low-level poisoning that accumulated over a lifetime. Medieval and Renaissance European courts later adopted antimony-based rouge and lip color, compounding the danger by adding topical exposure to a substance that was simultaneously being prescribed internally as a purging medicine by royal physicians, meaning some aristocratic patients were receiving antimony from their cosmetics and their doctors at the same time. The etymology of the word antimony is genuinely disputed. One popular account traces it to the Latin antimoine, meaning against monks, stemming from a story about monks who died after being given the compound as a fattening supplement, though linguists note this origin is not definitively established. Some historians have suggested speculatively that the cumulative heavy metal exposure in royal courts, from cosmetics, medicines, and leaded tableware simultaneously, may have contributed to the erratic behavior and declining health documented in various monarchs, though establishing direct causation across centuries is inherently difficult. Mercuric chloride skin lighteners. Mercury-based skin lighteners circulated through European and East Asian aristocratic beauty culture from roughly the 16th through the 19th centuries under names like Bloom of Youth and various other elegantly marketed titles that gave no indication of what they actually contained. Mercuric chloride, corrosive sublimate, worked by destroying melanin-producing cells in the skin, producing the pale, even complexion associated with nobility and indoor leisure. It worked visibly, at least temporarily, which made it genuinely convincing as a product before the cumulative effects became impossible to ignore. Long-term mercury exposure causes peripheral neuropathy, tooth loss, tremors, severe personality changes, memory deterioration, and kidney failure. The phrase "mad as a hatter" derives from hat makers who used mercury nitrate to process felt and suffered well-documented neurological damage. Same family of compounds was being applied to aristocratic faces as a beauty product during the same historical period, sometimes by the same chemical suppliers. In East Asian royal contexts, particularly within the Japanese imperial court, heavy white cosmetic appearances were required by court protocol, and mercury-based whiteners were documented components of the preparations used to achieve them. The Minamata disease outbreak in 1950s Japan, caused by industrial mercury contamination, provided modern medicine with a detailed clinical picture of what mercury does to the human nervous system at scale. And that picture maps almost exactly onto the symptoms described in historical accounts of prolonged cosmetic mercury use in aristocratic women centuries earlier. Tight neck stocks and collars. The military neck stock, a stiff leather or heavily starched cloth band buckled tightly around the throat, was mandatory in Prussian, French, and British military court dress from roughly the 1680s onward, and its stated purpose was to enforce the upright, rigid posture considered to convey martial bearing and aristocratic discipline. What it also did was create a documented choking hazard for any soldier who lost consciousness. Officers who fell in battle or collapsed from heat exhaustion could and did suffocate on their own stocks when no one was present to unbuckle them, and some accounts of the Battle of Waterloo reference soldiers found dead from causes that included constriction rather than wounds alone, though specific documentation for this is difficult to verify with precision. In civilian aristocratic men's fashion, the Regency-era obsession with high cravats and extreme collar points produced garments that physically restricted neck rotation to the point where some prominent dandies could not turn their heads independently and had to rotate their entire torsos to look sideways. Beau Brummel, the defining arbiter of Regency fashion, who was at the height of his influence between roughly 1800 and 1816, reportedly devoted hours to achieving the perfect cravat knot, and the heavily starched results pressed rigid fabric against the throat and jaw for entire days at court. High collar points constructed from stiffened card or bone lacerated the chin and jaw during movement, creating small chronic wounds that could become infected in an era before antibiotics, meaning the fashion that was meant to signal civilized refinement was also, at the edges, quietly cutting the people wearing it. Arsenic complexion wafers. Arsenic complexion pills and wafers were sold openly throughout the 19th century and consumed by aristocratic and upper-class women as a daily beauty regimen, not applied externally but swallowed, on the theory that internal arsenic would purify the blood and produce the clear pale skin that court appearance demanded. The chemistry, perversely, worked in the short term. Low doses of arsenic forced the body to produce new skin tissue while damaging capillaries near the surface, temporarily reducing redness and producing a pale, fine-textured appearance that made the product genuinely convincing. The fashion was partly inspired by reports of peasants in the Styrian region of Austria who allegedly consumed arsenic habitually and appeared robustly healthy, an observation documented in 19th-century sources but contested by modern historians who note that the health of those Styrian communities was probably being assessed by observers who had little basis for comparison. Long-term arsenic ingestion causes peripheral neuropathy, skin cancers, liver damage, and cardiovascular disease, and women who took complexion wafers daily were accumulating arsenic in their systems with no mechanism for eliminating it. The macabre overlap that gives this particular trend its sharpest edge is that arsenic was simultaneously the era's most notorious murder poison, called inheritance powder for its frequent use in poisoning wealthy relatives, and a product sold openly in elegant packaging on the same dressing tables where those wealthy relatives kept their other cosmetics. Fowler's solution, a medicinal arsenic preparation prescribed by doctors throughout the 19th century for conditions ranging from skin disorders to malaria, meant that some aristocratic women were receiving arsenic from their beauticians, their apothecaries, and their physicians simultaneously, with no one coordinating the total dose. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.